First Tunisia, then Egypt, and now Libya. A struggle for liberation has begun to spread. And how far will it go? Rudyard Griffiths spoke with Dambisa Moyo. She is an economist and author of New York Times bestseller, How the West Was Lost, 50 Years of Economic Folly. He started by asking her what she thought about the recent turmoil in North Africa.
As a lot of what we're seeing now happened already across much of Africa, glasnost, perestroika around across Eastern Europe and Russia and so on. But I think that we're sort of missing a bit of a trick here. I think that a lot of people are couching this as a pro-democracy movement. I think it's only partly that. I think it's really about economics and the fact that you have so many disaffected people and a large young population that is looked around the world and seeing significant progress in places like China and India and Brazil and feeling quite detached and lagging behind in terms of economics and the poverty statistics. So I think it's much more about that.
Now, you grew up in Zambia. You keep close connections with the continent of Africa. What's your sense about the potential for these kinds of, again, economically driven revolutions to spread southward into the continent? Further down, are we going to see that?
Well, we're already hearing rumblings of it. In Cameroon, I've heard there's a few rumblings in Zimbabwe as well, but I mean, Zimbabwe, it's been in a lot of dire straits for some time now. I mean, I think if you really believe the thesis that economics is driving a lot of the concerns and agitation, I think that there's a good probability that you will see this, not necessarily just in Africa, but across the emerging world. I mean, I do hesitate to say that because I don't think it will be on the large scale that we might anticipate or what we saw in the 1980s. But certainly, I think there is a great, increasing agitation amongst young people who represent, large swathes of people in the unemployed sector.
Well, let's talk about your latest book, How the West Was Lost, a kind of trenchant critique of not just this financial crisis, but many of the assumptions that the West is making about its own economic development and its own ability to challenge the rise of Canada. China. What do you, I wish it was Canada. What do you think the key things that the West is getting wrong right now in terms of its economy?
Well, I mean, the way the book is outlined is focusing on economic growth, the three key drivers of economic growth. So it's capital, labor, and productivity. And what I'm aiming to show here is that it's policies of unintended consequences, so good intentions that have yielded bad outcomes, that's eroding the United States and many of the leading developed countries' leads. So things like the subprime crisis is essentially born out of good policies, housing for all policies. But obviously these countries are over-leveraged, massive deficits. They've got very, very poor education statistics, both in absolute and relative terms. And these are absolutely feeding into this whole story of decline. So in essence, it's actually by deliberate and specific policies that have been implemented that we have this problem.
And you think, in a sense, what America and much of the West is doing wrong, right now China is doing right in terms of massive investments in infrastructure and skills development and maybe a more efficient allocation of capital.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, China, I think people get overly obsessed with the whole China story. It clearly needs to be commended. It's now the second largest economy in a GDP basis, but on a per capita income basis, it's still number 99. It's a very poor country. They've got serious problems around resource allocation, things like shortages around land, water, energy, and so on. And so I think what I'm really trying to highlight here is the decline in issues that the United States are facing has much less to do with what's going on in China and has much more to do with domestic policies. And again, it's not just the United States. Across Europe, you're seeing issues around pensions and healthcare costs that have mounted over time. Nobody really knows what the exact number is, but obviously these things are feeding into economic decline issues.
And what about the whole thesis of Chimerica, that there is this idea of a symbiotic relationship between these two economies, and maybe the assumption that as China emerges, as it continues to develop, that will raise all boats, including here in the West. Do you buy into that?
Well, I mean, I think that was what we thought, in 25 years ago. We thought that it was going to be the U.S. largesse into China that was going to float the Chinese boats. I mean, we've seen global income inequality come in, for sure, but obviously in the U.S. is now, in terms of real wages, they've been flat, and they still have a lot of economic concerns. I mean, I think to your point about the symbiotic relationship, I mean, the Chinese are brilliant at executing on symbiosis, not just the relationship between the U.S. and China around debt and trade, as we know, but also what they're doing in the resource sector. I mean, they're absolutely lending to these economies in return for natural resources, again, locking these countries into a symbiotic relationship. I mean, it's what the Chinese do best.
So if the West is or will be lost, how could it regain its prominence? Is that even possible at this point, or is it more just fighting a zero-sum game with a rising Asia?
Well, I'm actually quite optimistic that it can resolve the problems that it has. I think a lot of the stuff is quite obvious. I think the whole idea of borrowing for consumption is obviously bad. I mean, they need to borrow to invest. And the investment portfolio of investments are quite obvious. Things like infrastructure, things like education. But obviously the inherent problem is that politically nobody wants to focus on long-term structural problems. Everybody is rushing for myopia or the short-term issues.
4-year election cycle.
Absolutely. Well, even 2 years if you include midterms. And so the issue then becomes, what do we know to be true? And I think certainly China is going to keep growing. I think it's pretty clear China is going to keep growing faster than the United States and a lot of the European countries. But what we don't know at this point is, can China converge to the per capita levels, income levels of the United States or Europe? And the jury's out. Simply, we don't know, and especially since, again, coming back to the issue of resource constraints, China is going to face those constraints as they try to move 1 billion people towards the living standards of the West.
You put some pretty provocative ideas in your book, I think, to try to shake us out of our complacency about where the West is headed, including the possibility that some kind of structured default on America's debt may ultimately be one of the ways that they are going to have to use to get out of a prolonged decline if things end up in a worst-case scenario.
In fact, I'm glad you ended up on the word scenario, because what I offer is a number of scenarios. The notion of default is clearly not ideal, and it's not a recommendation by any stretch. However, many would argue very compellingly that the U.S. is already engaging in default by allowing their currency to weaken. Obviously, it's not something that is desirable, but we have to wait and see how bad things get in the United States. I mean, they are now having to go back to negotiate a higher debt ceiling. And as I said earlier, my concern is that a lot of the debt that they're accumulating is still being used to finance current expenditure and not much on the investment.
Final question. I want to go back to your book on foreign aid. It was an international sensation. What's been the knock-on effect on that? Have you seen that book really change, thinking in terms of both nations giving aid and nations receiving foreign aid?
Well, I would say in thinking, yes, a lot of people make promises thinking, but I think, there has been some progress. I know that a number of Scandinavian countries have actually scaled back their provisions of aid to a number of African countries, which I think is a good thing. There has been some discourse. Countries like Rwanda, for example, are on a specific path to cut back on their aid dependency. I'd like to think it's me who's encouraged that, but I'm sure a lot of that comes from the policy making that's going on in those countries. So, it's baby steps, but I think the fact of the matter is, given that Western countries, the traditional donors, are going through so many structural problems, it's only a matter of time that we have to come back to the table on the issues of foreign aid.
Great. Well, Dambisa, thanks for coming into BNN and spending some time with us today.
Thanks very much for having me here.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.